Mosse, thank you to the Mosse Center and for the University of Wisconsin Judaic Studies program. It's really an honor for me to be here and to speak with you. And I'm going to talk to you about weaving disparate narratives behind the scenes of Bergen-Belsen's liberation. And excuse me for 1 minute while I share my screen. And I will show you. Okay. This is the cover of my book. On the left, All the Horrors of War, a Jewish girl, a British doctor, and the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And to the right, you see the UK version. And I like to show this. It's kind of interesting when you give your publishers the same exact photos and content materials, same text, and they come up with they have completely different concepts for the cover. But here you see my mom, who is one of the protagonists in the book, Rachel Genuth, and here she is in full form. And you can see that she's well nourished. This is probably 8 months after the liberation. You could see that she has sort of a sad look in her eye. She was orphaned in Auschwitz and barely survived Bergen-Belsen. And here you see Glen Hughes, who was the liberator who spearheaded relief efforts at Bergen-Belsen. And the reason I really was compelled to write about him is there hasn't been a biography of him, and he's sort of an Oscar Schindler kind of character, very caring and very sympathetic to the Jews and to the survivors, and by extension, sees his role in the history of the Jewish people and became a champion of the state of Israel. So when I discovered him, I thought I really wanted to learn about this man. Who was he? What were his influences? And can I tell his story? And then I had this idea, this crazy idea, that I was going to write a dual biography about my mom and the brigadier. So how was I going to weave these disparate narratives? Now, it would have been really romantic had he discovered this young girl at Bergen-Belsen who was sick and dying and had nursed her and given her medical treatment and then adopted her, or something romantic like that. But that's not what happened, and that would have been highly unlikely. There were 60,000 inmates in Bergen-Belsen, and Glen Hughes really only became close with a few survivors, those who emerged in leadership roles. He had a very high position, and he was really supervising other doctors. So they didn't meet, and how was I going to tell the story of these two people? So I experimented with different formats over a period of 15 years, and finally settled with my editor at Johns Hopkins University Press on a sort of a race against time story. Where was he, where was she in the last year of the war, as they were coming close to this hellish concentration camp in Northwest Germany. So I have in the book, the way I structured it is there's a prologue and the epilogue. And these to me are some of the most important parts of the book, because I get to tell really about key events and stories that have to do with both my mom's life and Glen Hughes's life after the war and before, some really significant things. And then I have the content also sandwiched between a few pages of the Belsen trial, setting the stage, and then at the end where it's post-war and really what's happening at this trial. And here you see on the right, this is an Army Talks magazine from November 11th, 1945. While the trial was still going on in this makeshift courtroom in Lüneburg, Germany. It was a gymnasium. And here are the defendants. There were 45 Nazis brought to trial. The most famous among them, aside from Joseph Kramer, who was the head of the camp, was this Irma Grese, number 9, because she was this beautiful blonde beast who was only 22 years old and so sadistic. So anyway, I do talk a little bit about events in the trial, and it was really important because Glen Hughes was the first witness at this first trial to apply international law, which it was mandated to end immediately before the start of the Nuremberg trials, which are much more famous and which Dr. Hirsch is an expert on. I think her work is fascinating. So the meat of the book between these sandwiches is the four seasons. And then the fifth season, the point of where the protagonists converge in Bergen-Belsen. So I start really telling the story of what happened from the spring of 1944 to the, and then end it with the spring of 1945, the convergence in hell. So I'm going to really focus this presentation. I'm going to tell you a couple of things about the journey. I'll tell you where the protagonists were in the beginning of the journey, and I'll tell you where they were on D-Day. And then I'll tell you mostly what happened behind the scenes at Bergen-Belsen. And I'm going to show you a lot of things and talk about things that are not in the book, because the subject is just so large. Really, several books could be written on the topic. So beginning here in the Yorkshire Wolds was Glen Hughes. He was at this point Deputy Director of Medical Services for the British Second Army's 8th Corps, which would go on to see some of the worst fighting of the war. They were fighting the most ferocious panzer units and Nazi soldiers, and I talk about that. But here in the Yorkshire Wolds, they were chosen for a specific reason. The Yorkshire Wolds resembled the topography of Normandy, where they would land. And of course, there were going to be some surprises, having to fight through the hedgerows in Normandy, but that they did a lot of practice. And in his case, being that he was head of medical units, they had to set up and take down field hospitals and regimental aid posts. And he was a really into the details and making sure that everyone had a lot of practice in what they were doing. My mom was in Siget over here, and I don't have a single photograph of her or anyone in her family from her childhood from Siget, nothing. So I can just show you some images of this beautiful Carpathian mountain town, which was a very wonderful place for a child to grow up. It was 40% Jewish. There was probably about 31,000 residents, and there was a beautiful center of the town. This is an old photograph, old postcards from before my mom was even born, but these buildings are still standing there. And the mountains, of course, are still there. And Siget was here, and it was in Romania when my mom was born there, but this whole region was taken over by Hungary in 1940. So that was crazy making. She had to go to a different school. So as I mentioned, I have no photographs from my mom, but I did, and I just combined her memory for what did my grandparents look like and where did she live. So here she actually drew a map of her street. It was between Kigya Utsa, where the Jews were lined up and from where they were deported, and where Elie Wiesel's house was about over here, and Timar Utsa, and her address was Timar Utsa, and she was in this sort of alleyway. And when I went to Siget just before the pandemic, I was lucky to travel there. I tried to get a sense of just what it was and just the alley. So this picture won't mean anything to you, but it's kind of significant to me. From here to here is where this whole alleyway where there were lots of apartments, including her parents. So in Siget of 1944, my mom was sitting at the Passover Seder with her family. There were 9 people around the table, and she would never have imagined that 1 year later, only she and her older sister would survive from their entire family. So June 6, 1944, just another marker on the timeline. This is D-Day, right? So the Allies are landing in Normandy, and they're preparing to fight. And it was just one of the most amazing invasions in military history. And I just want to give you one stat, which is that there were twice as many people killed in Auschwitz on June 6th, 1944, as Allied soldiers who were killed during the Normandy landing on June 6th, 1945. 1944. And the number of Allied soldiers who were killed, I mean, it was terrible, terrible tragedy and catastrophe, but the numbers decreased each day, even with the unbelievable fighting that was happening. And I talk about it in my book, but the numbers did not decrease in Auschwitz for at least another month. And this was just a couple of images from Auschwitz. And my mom had already been in Auschwitz for 3 weeks at this point. This shows the deportation and the separation. And as I'm showing you some of the photographs, you might want to just think about, how they were taken, who took this. Maybe this was taken by an SS officer or a German, but you can see almost behind the scenes. Yes, it looks like order. It looks like the men are separated from the women and they're lined up. But if you probably had a magnifying glass and examined these photographs really closely, you can see a woman talking to a child, or people talking and looking, and really what's happening. What are they saying? So this is just another image of, I just have to show this because I got very deep into Glen Hughes's files, and he had thousands and thousands of pages of notes. And this is just an example of a few things from his notebooks. And this is D+1, D+2, D+3, the number of days after D-Day, and how many casualties there were, and how many were evacuated, and where they were, and the special units that he had to bring, and the hospitals that he was commandeering along the way, and how many beds they had. And I'm showing you this as an example of how prepared this man was and how focused he was on details. And when he came to Bergen-Belsen, it was a situation for which by that point, by the way, he was deputy director of medical services for the entire British Second Army. He had been promoted, and he was just totally unprepared for what he came across there. So April 15th, 1945 is when the British entered Bergen-Belsen. And I tremble in showing you some of the next photos, but I want you to have a little sense of what it was, though no one who was there said that any photo or film could capture it really. So it was quite a remarkable story. By April 15th, my mom had been in Bergen-Belsen already for 1 month, and she was really, the norm was death. Anne Frank, I calculate, depending on which source you go to, but she probably died within a week or two of when my mom arrived there. She was a little bit older than my mom. And death was the norm. About 17,000 people died in the month of March alone. Now, you have to realize that who were the people who were being brought to Bergen-Belsen in the winter and spring of 1945. These were the people who these were the strong people, the survivors. They had already evaded the gas chambers. They had been taken to labor camps where they performed slave labor, some enduring really very hard circumstances, beatings and malnutrition, and they were in very bad shape. They had already endured a death march, being brought to Bergen-Belsen, many of them. And here they were dumped here. It was the largest depository of inmates as they were being shuttled away from liberating forces. So you had 60,000 people in 2 camps. The largest of camp had 41,000 people. That was the horror camp, and that's where my mom was. And this is a picture of the horror camp here. And it's not a good picture. I mean, it doesn't show you people, but there was a road bisecting the camp. There were 3 huge compounds on one side, 2 on the other. And my mom was in one of them, and sort of calculated where she was and where she moved to and from. But this road was the road in which they organized a parade of prisoners to drag the dead to a mass grave at the end of the road. And this was in an effort to clean up the camp when they knew the British were coming. And the Germans knew the British were coming on April 12th, which is when they signed a truce, which involved putting danger typhus signs all around the area. And it was just a truth is stranger than fiction story where Himmler, who ordered other inmates to be killed in other camps, no inmate was to be turned over alive, according to Hitler, completely handed this concentration camp over to the British with 60,000 sick and dying people in it. That was unusual. So there were about 80 SS officers who remained in the camp during the process of the transition. The horror camp was Camp 1, where my mom was. There were, just by the way, about 500 Nazi officers working in the camp, most of whom escaped and got off scot-free. So remember, there were about 45 who were prosecuted at the trial. 80 were, some of them were here, 80 people to help with the transition. They were immediately pressed into service to help with the burials. Here on the bottom, you could see Rabbi Leslie Hardman, who was a chaplain with the British Second Army, who was just bereft at how people were being buried on these pits, 12 feet deep, 20 to 30 feet wide, 40 to 50 feet long. And it was a catastrophic situation. And I talk about Glen Hughes, what he went through in thinking about how people had to be buried and giving the order. And here on the upper right, you see inmate survivor with a square cut out of the back of her coat. And this just reminded me of my mom, because she told me that all the coats at the labor camp where she was had this square cut out of the back. Lest anyone should try to escape, they would be easily identifiable. And I just read, my work just never ends, because there's always more information that's even after the book is published. I just read an account of girls who sewed the original fabric in and sewed like a fake fabric over it. So if they did try to escape, they just ripped off the second layer of fabric and they wouldn't be so easy to be picked out. And here's just a scene on the bottom, and you can just imagine the photographers. What are they trying to show? What are they trying to capture? And I could just tell you that the people, the professionals, the military photographers from the British Army's film and photographic unit were having practically a nervous breakdown doing this work. It was really difficult for them. And it was really difficult for Rabbi Leslie Hardman. No one had ever seen scenes like this or prepared for it. And here's just a couple of other scenes of the camp. Here's a scene on the bottom that again reminded me of something my mom shared with me. These women, you could see in the background, they're inured to the stench, which really affected the incoming liberators, and they're inured to the sights of dead people everywhere. And here these women probably scavenged and got some potatoes and figured out a way to cook them after the liberation, but it was complicated. The liberation behind the scenes was not like the British come in and the sun is shining and it's blue skies and everyone's cheering. It was not like that. The liberation process took a long time, at least a month. And at first, when Glen Hughes came in with the British Second Army, they could not, they didn't have the personnel. There were battles raging all throughout the area where they were in Northwest Germany, and what were they going to do? Where were they going to find human resource power? So for the first few days, actually, they left Hungarian guards in charge who would sit up on their watchtowers and shoot inmates who were running to get potatoes from the mounds. So this image also, it's kind of blurry, it might not look like much to you, but it is of tents and the huts. The British called these like barracks huts, where people were laying, the dead and living were laying together. It took days to separate them from each other. And they were one mass of human excreta on the bottom because there was no latrines and everybody was suffering from gastroenteritis, among other diseases that were raging in the camps, such as tuberculosis and typhus. So what the British tried to do is relieve the overcrowding in the huts and set up tents outside on the third day after the liberation on April 18th. And my mom was still ambulatory at that point and was taken to a tent and then wound up back in the hut where she was beaten by her fellow inmates until she fell unconscious. So behind the scenes of Bergen-Belsen's liberation, it's not as if there's anyone monitoring the situation. Really terrible things are happening after the liberation. So the rescue. So a lot of things, when COVID broke last year at this time, and there was in the Boston Globe where I live in Boston, there was this full page ad that was taken out by the major hospitals and the doctors saying that they might not have enough ventilators and they may have to institute some kind of system of triage. It was sort of a wartime situation, which it still is in other places in the world, right? It's terrible in Brazil and in India. So, but it reminded me a lot of war and triage and what the British had to do in order to begin the process of rescue, right? There was at least 25,000 people who needed hospitalization. Where would they find a hospital? Where would they find clean blankets? Where would they find beds? Where would they find bedpans? How were they going to take people from one place to the other? So they got organized pretty quickly. And here are these men from the 11th Light Field Ambulance who are wearing these protective clothing and taking the inmates in contaminated ambulances to this cavalry stables that was about 1.5 miles from the main camp, where they set up 60 tables and factory style, they started to wash down the inmates. Now, the triage system meant they had to go into huts, and the medics who first went into the huts marked those inmates whom they thought had a chance at life with like a red cross on their foreheads with like chalk. So I just learned I was listening to one of my aunt's testimonies, and she was there, and she said that when they came into her hut, she begged them to take her sister first, but then she wanted to be taken as well. And the women there found pieces of chalk on the floor of the hut and were marking their own foreheads. Or there's all kinds of things that happen. Some of them are in the book, but all kinds of things happen behind the scenes. But there were going to be, and there were people who were still breathing, whom the medic had to determine very quickly in a judgment call did not have much of a chance of surviving, and they would have to be left there to die. And so they had to sort of look people over, and how far gone were they? How emaciated were they? How diseased were they? Did they have a chance of surviving? Could they take them to the hospital? And they made mistakes. They took lots of people to the hospital who really didn't have a chance. But how would they know? How would they know? My mom was in a hospital room for 3 weeks where every day they took out 11 dead. There were 12 in her room. They took out 11 dead and brought in 11 nearly dead. And she was the 12th person, very far gone, but she pulled through. And these in the human laundry, these are German nurses from the area, right? They didn't have enough personnel, so they had to bring in German nurses to sponge people down and spray them with DDT. They were supervised by British Army personnel, but some of the inmates were freaked out by being handled by Germans. So here's just some approximate numbers. I'll read from the bottom. There were 14,000 patients in the Glen Hughes Hospital, and it was named for Glen Hughes because survivors discerned his compassion and his warmth and his caring and his moral motivation, because as soon as he surveyed the camp, he determined he wanted to save as many lives as possible. So they named the hospital complex the Glen Hughes Hospital, the largest such facility in Europe, on May 19th, 1945. It took 2 weeks for the backlog of corpses to be buried. 500 former inmates died each day for a month after the liberation. There were just 361 British Army soldiers and medical personnel working in the relief of Bergen-Belsen 2 days after the liberation, which was a very small number to handle that. 750 to 1,000 sick were processed each day for over 3 weeks after the liberation at the human laundry. And there were 25,000 people who were categorized as fit, they were able to, actually the test was, could they walk up 3 steps to a wagon or a truck? And they were transferred to formerly Wehrmacht transit and rehabilitation barracks. And it was kind of back and forth because a lot of the people who were determined to be fit fell sick and wound up in the hospital. So the real rescue effort took about a month, April 23rd to May 21st. On May 21st, the last hut was burned. Each time a hut was evacuated, it had to be burned down. And when the last hut was evacuated, there was a big ceremony to commemorate the event. And though the war had ended on May 8th, and think about it, Bergen-Belsen was liberated 3 weeks before the end of the war. And the liberation was not finished until 2 weeks after the end of the war. On May 21st was when Glen Hughes first allowed the British flag, the Union Jack, to be hoisted at this ceremony. And here's Glen Hughes here. And yeah, and here's assigned to the hospital. And this is the hospital. So this is just something of interest. It was a big event, the burning down of the last hut in Bergen-Belsen, and it had to be burned down because of the typhus. This small country off Sri Lanka, the Maldives, issued this 50th anniversary of the end World War II stamps. And one of them was of this event and this moment. And here's the actual photograph. And here is the stamp with an elegy of Hitler being burned and the Iron Cross being burned. And you can imagine what it felt like for the survivors who came, those who were well enough, who came to observe the ceremony, to see the image of Hitler, the effigy of Hitler being burned. And here's some British soldiers also witnessing the event. And this is just a little survey I did of the birth year of Belsen survivors from Siget who arrived in Sweden. Because it was just, Siget had a population of 11,500, 13,000 were deported from Siget, which included the surrounding villages. There were people from Siget, maybe there were a total of 2,000 survivors from Siget, maybe, I'm not sure. But they could have been in different places at the end of the war. Not all of them were in Bergen-Belsen. There were some who were in Bergen-Belsen who did not go to Sweden, but Sweden did take in 7,000 of the sickest survivors from Bergen-Belsen to in a humanitarian gesture. And there might have been other reasons that Sweden took in sick survivors, but they took in 7,000 people aiming to get them on their feet, thinking that they might be repatriated after 6 months. My mom lived in Sweden for 10 years. She was here. She was born 1929. And these are the 174 survivors from Siget who were in Bergen-Belsen, wound up in Sweden after the war. And I just thought the age breakdown was kind of interesting and telling, because it did give an indication of the people who had the greatest chance of surviving by demographic, by age. So very few people in their 50s, very few in their 40s, some in their 30s. The vast majority were in their 20s. And my mom was 15 and her sister was 17, born in 1928. So this is probably the only picture that I'm showing you that is in the book. It's very precious because this is the first picture we have of my mom ever. It's just this is taken, I guess, 4 months after the liberation, and you can see I blew up the picture of my mom. She is in a Katrina home, Sweden. After quarantine, she was sent to this makeshift hospital, and you could see that she still has this vacant look on her eyes and still has bruises under her eyes. And this Dr. Leffler, saved her life. It was the first time she had personalized medical care. And the epilogue, really quickly, I'll just show you. This is Glen Hughes. During the war, you could see the seriousness in his eyes. I write about him in the epilogue. He was a sportsman and a great figure in England. He was father figure of rugby football. He was very involved in the National Health Service. And he did some other things after the war that I think I connected in some way to his experience, the watershed of his life, of liberating people and seeing the survivors come back to life. That was an amazing summer for him after the liberation, the summer of 1945. Here's my mom and her sister. They're young ladies in Sweden. Here's her wedding picture to my dad. My dad was also a survivor. Here's my dad in a DP camp. And here's my mom today. And she speaks to school groups all over, and I'm really proud of her. And I'll just go through this very quickly. While mourning incalculable losses, survivors, nearly all of whom had lost most of their relatives, formed a vibrant displaced persons community. And my mom, being that she went to Sweden in July of 1945, just a few months after the liberation, was not really part of this phenomenon of the displaced persons community in Bergen-Belsen, which was the largest in Nazi-occupied Europe. People came from all over. And it was a remarkable story of rebirth. First, the survivors, no matter their backgrounds, whether they're religious or not, they united around a common goal, which was trying to make a new life for themselves in this place called Palestine. And here's Yossel Rosensaft, who's emerged as one of the leaders of this movement, who was a lot of these people were in Zionist youth organizations before the war. There's soldiers from the British Brigade in Palestine who actually fought the Nazis, who came to visit the camp. And it was very powerful. There was a concentration camp theater in the camp, very cathartic for survivors to see performances reflecting their immediate past experiences. There was the Organization for Rehabilitation and Training that came to train the survivors to give them skills for a career after. And there was rabbis who were weighing in on what would happen if people got married. People were coupling like crazy after the war. They were looking to marry, to start new families. Many of them had lost most of their families in the war. What happened if a former spouse did show up at some point? So there was a special Bergen-Belsen ketubah with provisions for a former spouse, should that person have survived. And people were coupling like crazy. And it was a huge baby boom, maybe the largest in human history. Far more people were born to Jewish women in Bergen-Belsen. There was at the peak, there was about 12,000 people at this displaced persons camp than in the German surrounding areas. So there was a gun country and everything. So I'm just going to play for you now a video by Tzvi Azaria Herman Helfgott, who spent the war in a Yugoslavian POW camp, who came to Bergen-Belsen to help out and very soon after the liberation.
ולקבור אותם, לראות מי נפטר, להוציא אותם ולקבור אותם. אבל מה? הייתה פקודה מאנגלים שאי אפשר קבר אחים לעשות בגלל המחלות, אלא קבר אחים. קבר אחים. כולם יחד. כלומר, שורה אחת, נגיד 20-30, על זה כן סיד, כן, ועל זה שוב כן איזה 30-20 וזה, כמו שהיה במחנה המוות הזה, איפה שאלפים כן. אבל יום אחד ניגשה אליי אישה, ואמרה לי, רבי, שמעתי היום שבבלוק הזה וזה, ביתי נפטרה. אז אמרתי, אז מה לעשות? אני רוצה קבר בשבילה, קבר יחיד. אמרתי, אבל זה בלתי אפשרי. אבל לכן אני מבקשת ממך. אז אמרתי לה, את יודעת מה? בלילה כשחיילים בדרך כלל, האנגלים, נמצאים במועדונים, אז אנחנו נקבור אותם. אנחנו נביא את הגופה, ואנחנו כן נקבור אותם. ובאמת, בלילה היא קמה מהמיטה, ואני ניסיתי מהר לקבור אותה, קדיש להגיד, ופתאום כשאני רציתי כבר סתום את הגולם, היא אומרת לי, רגע אחד רבי. והיא פנתה עם העיניים לשמיים ואמרה, ריבונו של עולם, ביידיש, אני מודה לך לזכות הגדולה שנתת לי היום לקבור את ביתי במו ידיי. אמן. מרגע זה, אני מוכרח להגיד, נעשיתי אדם אחר. עשינו עכשיו את הכל על מנת לעזור לאנשים, כן, בדרך לחיים. ופה התחלנו לאשכול לדאוג, היו כמה ילדים לגן ילדים, ואחר כך להקים בית ספר, כן. פה עזרו לנו הרבה אנשי בריגדה שהגיעו כבר בזמן הזה, כן, לברגן-בלסן גם כן. והקמנו כבר גם כן תיאטרון, כן. חיים חדשים התחילו, כן. ופה אני עסקתי עד 48, כן. פה בתורה, חתונות התחילו, כן. ברית מילות, כן, וכו'. ואני לא צריך להדגיש כמה שאני הייתי מאושר. כל משפחה רצתה שבברית מילה שאני נתת לכולם כבר קידושים שאני אחזיק את הילד. היום המאושר ביותר בחיים שלי היה בילד האלף כשאני החזקתי לידיי. הילד האלף.
Okay. Oops, sorry. So I just wanted to end with that. And I'll just, I have more images and pictures if you're interested on my website, which is bernicelerner.com. But I just want you to think for a minute about what this rabbi was telling us. Can you just imagine the life force in these people who had undergone so much that even that they're circumcising their sons? That's such a marker of being Jewish when it was so dangerous to be Jewish. So I think that's a powerful note to end on, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk and very moving. So I'd like to invite people to, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and then I'll invite you to unmute. And if you want to, I think you're able to put your video on at that point and to introduce yourself and ask your question. And Serena Cullen has a question so in the chat already. So why don't we start with you, Serena? Are you able to unmute yourself there? I might need to unmute. Wait, ask to unmute. Sky, are we? All right, well, I will ask Serena's question for her, and then Serena, if you want to come on. So Serena says, what's
sorry,
that?
Everyone should be able now to unmute themselves and to start their video.
All right, well, I will ask Serena's question for her right now, and then hopefully people will be able to unmute. And please, oh, she says her mic is not working. So she says, first of all, thank you so much for this amazing opportunity to attend your presentation. She's a student in Professor Bitzan's Jewish history class. She says, your work is amazing and very fascinating. My personal favorite aspect is that I admire so much how much time, years, you spent creating this book. My question is, who exactly are the people who are taking these photos? Were they given to you? Were the photographers part of the British?
Oh, the photographers, first of all, you can find on Google Images quite a few images. Bergen-Belsen was the most photographed camp at its liberation. In fact, I mean, I'm often, when I see other like things about the Holocaust and they throw in the liberation or the story of what happened, you'll often see images from Bergen-Belsen thrown in, because those are the images we have a lot of, and they tell a story. But these were people from the film and photographic unit of the British Second Army.
Thank you. So I have a question here from James Nelkin. James, would you like to unmute? Well, I can't see people.
Okay, yeah,
there you
here
go.
I am.
Hello, hi. All right.
Anyway, I was wondering what was the, the political or the, practical arrangements of using the Hungarian and German troops to, perform various functions in the camp after the liberation. And presumably this was after the surrender of Germany, or was this before the surrender of Germany?
This was before, and the Hungarian guards were there already. And it wasn't unusual during the war for the Germans to, I mean, wherever they were, they pressed other people from other nationalities, soldiers or sergeants or whatever, whether it was in the Ukraine killing or whether they needed help in Hungary, they just pressed other people into service. And we know they even did it with Jews, of course, with capos and things like that. They needed to maintain control over the place. And Hungarian guards were in charge and brutal. They were shooting people left and right after the liberation.
Thank you. All right, so as other people write their questions in, I'm gonna take the liberty as the co-host and ask a question that I have on my mind, because I know that when I was working on my book about the Nuremberg trials, it was it's just so emotionally difficult to work with some of the materials, right? To work with witness testimony, to read the transcript, to look at the photographs, to really just to live with that story. And I don't have that direct personal connection that you do. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that process of just how you made the decision to write the book, and what the process of working on it was like for you.
Yeah. So truth be told, I stayed away from writing about my mom for many, many years. I didn't even set out to write this book about her. So it was particular times of my life, it was really painful. Like when I had small children, identified not with my mom, but with my grandmother, who had to walk into the gas chambers with 3 little girls, or, and I just think it was the most terrible thing to rob parents of the chance to even protect their children. So there were painful times, but my mom was, to me, because she was a young teenager, she was this sort of girl victor over Hitler. And because I was always able to ask her questions and she would be able to answer them, only on a very few occasions was she, teary. She sort of held it together, and it was really helpful having her during the process. So I sort of removed myself a little bit to write about some of the really emotional parts. And I have her with me still. So I was very lucky to be able to say to her, to sort of get her in the frame of mind of being in a particular place and time, and ask her, for example, when you were on the death march, what were you wearing? So I tried to get as many details as I could for the narrative, for the book, and it's hard to get it 100%, but I was really driven to do the best job I could for the book to be as honest and authentic as I could get it to be. And it's a narrative nonfiction, but it's very factual, very straightforward. And I don't do a lot of, I'm not a writer who can really embellish things very much. But I think the details just speak for themselves. So I sort of removed myself a little bit, and it was just the need to know. I think when you write, it's the curiosity that drives you. You want to, and then you don't know, like you go down all these other paths and you never know which where you'll find these gems that you want to include in the book.
Yeah, no, it is, I'll say it again, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. It's really an achievement. Okay, so Riley Demarais has a question. Would you like to unmute and ask?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure. I mean, it's basically kind of similar to the question you just answered, so sorry about that. But I was just wondering, like, what you thought the hardest part was in telling other people's stories, and if you thought it was difficult in doing this and like doing people's stories justice.
Really hard. I mean, and remember, these are two disparate narratives, right? So I had my mom, I could ask her things. I didn't have Glen Hughes. So I had to just go by everything that was written by him and about him. And a lot of his friends had died. And I just tried to meet with whoever who knew him personally, who was still around. But it was a challenge because I don't know, it was very hard to get into his head and know exactly from his point of view. You know, biographers can only work with the material they have. So that was a challenge.
Thanks. Lori Merrill has a question. Lori, would you like to unmute?
Okay. You said that your mother was returned to a hut, and then she was beaten, I believe it sounded like by other prisoners, not by the guards. Why did they beat her?
Because I described this in the book. It was a terrible story, but she was expelled from the hut by the girls she was with in the hut. They were 5 girls, and the eldest of them expelled her from the hut because she couldn't perform her duties as being part of the hut. And again, this is all like behind the scenes. And she crawls back. She's so sick. She crawls back to she was expelled from the tent. She crawls back to the hut, and then she tries to reclaim her spot that she had against the wall. And her people who were occupying that spot beat her up to a pulp. Now, you have to realize that you don't think about these things, but when you have no food and you have no water and you're dying, a spot against the wall is meaningful. And you have tuberculosis. My mother was really sick with TB, and she could rest her aching back. So, and I could just tell you that every little thing meant something. So she was beaten up, and her last thought before she lost consciousness was, "We will never be human beings again." She certainly never thought she would walk upright again.
Wow, I have to say that scene in your book, I don't know why, it was one of the scenes that I found most shocking, actually. Which, you know, there's so much that's shocking, but you expect it to be, and yeah, for me that scene was really kind of unexpected. So yeah, no, thanks. Okay, so Nancy Siegel has a question.
Oh, I was wondering when your parents came to the United States and what it was like growing up as the child of survivors for you.
So my father came in 1948, and I'm working on a book about him. He was one of the first people admitted under the Truman Displaced Persons Act. And my mom came after she married my father. She came in 1955. And because she had spent 10 years in Sweden, right, from 1945 to 1955. And as far as what it was like growing up as a child of survivors, I didn't know any different, right? I mean, these were my parents, and my father's family, it was a very unbelievable miracle, but out of 8 children at the time of the war, 6 survived. So I had aunts, uncles, and cousins. And it was kind of, when I was young, it was kind of interesting that I had parents from Czechoslovakia and Romania, and they spoke all these languages at home. Other people in the neighborhood used to come to our fence when they had barbecues just to listen in, all these languages being spoken. But these were my parents, right? I don't know how it would be to grow up under other circumstances. I didn't have grandparents, so it was interesting for me to, meet my husband's grandparents, and I have no role models for being a grandparent. And that was it. I mean, my parents didn't dwell on the war. They were really busy trying to work very, very hard in this country to save, to build a life, trying to be American, not able to succeed at that, right? Because they were cooking, food from other countries, and their habits and their values were really straight out of the Eastern European shtetl. But it was very loving home, and my parents were very supportive. And yeah, so it was, yeah, I would say my mom was very resilient. She was very young. My father was older than her by 8 years, and he had more, I would say, looking back, he probably had PTSD. And it was the hardest on me when I was a teenager, because he never wanted me to go out at night, right? A teenager wants to go out at night. And I was president of my B'nai B'rith Girls chapter, and I used to go out to run meetings, and he used to say to me, "Can't you just stay home and read a book?" And I didn't realize until much later that when his loved ones were out of his sight, they were murdered. His parents were taken away and murdered. So the world is a scary place for someone like that who had been through that.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I think we're almost at the 8 o'clock mark. And so I think that we'll all just, give Bernice a round of applause and appreciation, really, for being with us tonight, and for that really, really wonderful talk.
Thank you so
much.
much. And if anyone has any further questions, they can always reach me through my website.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight.